Wyoming Territory, summer of 1883. The shovel hit rock again, sending shockwaves up Eleanor Hayes's arms and into her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, alone on a homestead claim with a dry well and a husband who'd been dead 3 weeks, she understood with perfect clarity that survival wasn't about deserving it. It was about being too stubborn to lie down and quit. What she didn't know was that help wore spurs and carried the weight of its own grief in calloused hands. The man who would change everything was watching her from the ridgeline, trying to decide if interfering in a stranger's struggle was kindness or insult. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started the way every morning had started since Marcus died, with Eleanor waking to silence so complete it felt like drowning. No sound of her husband's boots on the plank floor, no smell of coffee brewing, no low voice humming while he dressed in the pre-dawn darkness. Just emptiness and the relentless Wyoming wind rattling the shutters of the half-built cabin Marcus had promised would be finished before winter. Eleanor pushed herself upright with effort, her pregnant belly making every movement awkward and deliberate. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the early hour. 7 months along now and showing more each day. Soon she'd be unable to do the heavy work that kept this claim alive. Soon, but not yet. She dressed in Marcus's old work shirt, the only thing that still fit over her expanding middle, and thick canvas pants she'd altered with extra fabric panels. Her own dresses hung useless in the corner, relics of a smaller body and a different life. The life where she'd been a banker's daughter in Philadelphia, where she'd worn silk and attended concerts, where the hardest decision she'd faced was which suitor to accept. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone Eleanor had read about in a book and barely remembered. Marcus's canteen hung by the door, still half full from his last day. She'd refilled it a dozen times since then, unable to dump out the water he'd last touched. Stupid, she knew. Sentimental in a way this territory didn't permit. But she refilled it anyway, drinking from it each morning like a ritual that kept him somehow present. The well had gone dry 4 days after Marcus's funeral. Eleanor had noticed the water level dropping for weeks, had mentioned it to Marcus, who'd promised to dig deeper once the summer heat broke. But then the horse had spooked during a thunderstorm, thrown Marcus against the fence post with enough force to crack his skull, and suddenly all his promises were just words scattered on wind. The nearest water was Bitter Creek, 2 miles east. Eleanor had been hauling buckets on foot, making the trip twice daily, her back screaming and her feet blistering inside. Boots that were too large. Marcus's boots because hers had worn through and there was no money for new ones. But hauling water from the creek wasn't sustainable. The baby would come in 2 months, maybe less. She'd need water close. Water for drinking, cooking, washing, for keeping herself and an infant alive through a Wyoming winter that was already whispering promises of brutality in the early morning cold. So she'd started digging, widening the existing well, going deeper, praying the water table hadn't shifted or dried up entirely. Each morning before the heat became unbearable, she climbed down into the hole Marcus had started and swung the pickaxe until her shoulders burned and her vision blurred. Today was no different. Eleanor gathered her tools, the pickaxe, the shovel, the rope tied around her waist in case she fell, and walked to the well behind the cabin. The hole was 12 feet deep now, maybe 13, deep enough that climbing out required the rope and considerable effort, deep enough that if she slipped and fell wrong, she'd break bones or worse. She should stop. She knew that pregnant women weren't supposed to do this kind of labor. But pregnant women also weren't supposed to be alone on homestead claims with no help and no alternatives, so the rules seemed negotiable. Eleanor lowered herself into the well, feet finding the crude footholds Marcus had chipped into the wall. The air grew cooler as she descended and damper. That was encouraging. Meant water was somewhere below, just a matter of reaching it. She picked up the pickaxe and swung. The impact jarred through her whole body, making the baby protest with sharp kicks. Again, rock and clay coming loose in chunks that she'd haul up later in the bucket. The rhythm was almost meditative. Swing, breathe, swing, breathe. Ignore the pain in your lower back. Ignore the pressure in your pelvis. Ignore everything except the next swing. She didn't hear the horse approach, didn't hear the boots on hard ground or the man calling down into the well. Only realized she had company when a shadow fell across the opening above and a voice said, "Ma'am, you planning to dig to China or you got a more reasonable destination in mind?" Eleanor looked up, squinting against the bright circle of sky. A man's silhouette, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. She couldn't see his face against the backlight. "I'm planning to dig until I hit water," she called back. "Then I'm planning to stop. Now, if you're here to buy the claim, the answer's no. If you're here for any other reason, I'm armed and not particularly patient today." The lie about being armed came easily. She'd learned quickly that appearing vulnerable invited trouble. "Not here to buy anything," the man said. His voice was low, roughened by wind or tobacco. "Saw you from the ridge this morning, watched you climb down into that hole, and I thought, there's someone about to make a widow of herself, digging a well 7 months, pregnant. Seemed worth mentioning." "I'm already a widow," Eleanor said flatly. "So that particular ship has sailed." A pause. Then, "My condolences, but that doesn't make what you're doing any less dangerous. You got anyone helping you, family, neighbors." "I've got myself, that's sufficient." She turned back to the wall, swung the pickaxe to make her point clear. The conversation was over, but the shadow didn't move. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but sufficient isn't the same as safe. You fall down there, break a leg, or worse, who's going to know? Who's going to pull you out?" Eleanor set down the pickaxe, looked up again with irritation rising hot in her throat. "What exactly are you proposing? That I just stop? Let the well stay dry and haul water from the creek until the baby comes and I can't walk 2 miles anymore? That I give up the claim and go back east and throw myself on my father's mercy after he disowned me for marrying beneath my station?" Her voice cracked. "I'm doing what I have to do. Now kindly mind your own business." The man crouched at the edge of the well, and for the first time Eleanor could see him properly. Weathered face, maybe 40, with deep lines around his eyes and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore working clothes, denim and leather, dusty from riding, and his expression was thoughtful, rather than judgmental. "Name's Daniel Crawford," he said. "I run cattle about 3 miles north of here. Been watching this claim since your husband filed it last spring. Watched him build that cabin, start this well, work himself half to death trying to prove up before winter." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss. Marcus was a good man. We spoke a few times at the land office." Eleanor's throat tightened. Hearing Marcus's name from a stranger's mouth made the loss fresh again, sharp as broken glass. "Thank you," she managed. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." But Daniel Crawford didn't move. "Here's my proposal. I finish this well for you. Should take maybe 2 days of hard digging, and I've got the equipment and experience to do it safely. You keep yourself and that baby out of holes you might not climb back out of, and I sleep better knowing I'm not going to find you dead at the bottom of your own well come September." Eleanor stared at him. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "Don't need to know you to recognize someone who needs help and is too proud to ask for it." He stood, dusted off his hands. "I lost my wife 2 years back. Childbirth. The baby didn't make it either, so I know what it's like to be alone with work that's too big for one person. I know what it's like when everyone tells you to give up because the odds are stacked wrong." The honesty in his voice stripped away Eleanor's defensive anger, leaving only exhaustion. "I can't pay you," she said quietly. "I have almost nothing left after the funeral expenses." "Didn't ask for payment, asked to help. People don't help for free, there's always a price." Her father's lessons, delivered in his study while he explained why servants couldn't be trusted and business partners would always betray you given sufficient incentive. Daniel's expression softened. "Some people do, not many maybe, but some." He extended his hand down into the well. "Come on up out of there. Let me at least look at what you're working with, see how deep we need to go." Eleanor considered. Every instinct told her to refuse, to protect her independence, to avoid owing anyone anything. But the baby kicked again, hard enough to make her wince, and she thought about falling, about lying injured at the bottom of this hole, with no one to hear her call for help. She took his hand. His grip was strong and steady, and he pulled her up with surprising ease, taking most of her weight until she could get her feet under her on solid ground. Standing face to face, Eleanor realized Daniel Crawford was taller than Marcus had been, broader through the shoulders with the kind of weathered solidity that came from years of hard outdoor work. His eyes were gray-blue, kind despite the hardness of his features. "Thank you," she said, brushing dirt from her pants. "For pulling me up, I mean. Not for I haven't decided about the well yet." "Fair enough." Daniel walked to the edge, peered down into the darkness. "You've made good progress. Another 6 feet and you'll hit water table if I'm reading the geology right. But the walls need shoring up before you go deeper or the whole thing could collapse." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She didn't know how to shore up well walls, didn't have the materials or knowledge. Daniel must have seen the despair on her face, because he said quickly, "I've got lumber at my place, built 3 wells on my property. I can bring what we need, reinforce as we dig. Like I said, 2 days of work." "And what do you want in exchange?" Eleanor asked bluntly, because in my experience, men who offer help to women alone on homesteads usually want something specific in return. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I want you and that baby to survive the winter, that's all. No other expectations, no debts owed. You can believe that or not, but it's the truth." They stood in the hot morning sun, 2 strangers separated by grief and suspicion, and the vast gulf between Philadelphia breeding and frontier pragmatism. Eleanor searched his face for deception, for the angle, for whatever trap was waiting to spring. She found only weariness that matched her own, and something that looked like genuine concern. 2 days, she said finally. You help with the well, and then you leave me alone to work my claim in peace. No obligations, no debts, no assumptions about what I might owe you. Agreed. Daniel extended his hand again, this time for a handshake. I'll be back tomorrow morning with supplies. Meanwhile, stay out of that hole. Eleanor shook his hand, his palm rough with calluses. Tomorrow, then. She watched him ride away, his horse kicking up dust that hung golden in the slanting light. When he disappeared over the ridge, Eleanor sank onto the bench Marcus had built beside the cabin door and let herself shake. She'd accepted help from a stranger. It went against everything her father had taught her about self-reliance, about the dangers of depending on anyone, about how showing weakness invited exploitation. But the baby kicked again, and Eleanor put both hands on her belly, felt the strong movements of a child who deserved to be born into a world with clean water and a fighting chance. Maybe her father's lessons didn't apply out here. Maybe the frontier operated on different rules where survival trumped pride and accepting help wasn't surrender but strategy. Or maybe Daniel Crawford was exactly what he appeared to be, a lonely man trying to do something good to fill the space where his own family should have been. Either way, tomorrow he'd return, and Eleanor would be waiting, pickaxe in hand, ready to finish what Marcus had started, ready to prove that a banker's daughter from Philadelphia could survive in Wyoming territory, even when the odds said otherwise, ready to dig until she hit water or rock or the limits of her own stubborn determination, whichever came first. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel Crawford arrived before sunrise, his wagon loaded with lumber, rope, and tools that gleamed even in the dim light. Eleanor had been awake for an hour, unable to sleep past the moment when darkness began yielding to gray. She'd made coffee from her dwindling supply, rationing it carefully, and now stood on the porch, watching him approach. He didn't wave or call out a greeting, just pulled the wagon to a stop near the well, began unloading with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Eleanor walked over, coffee cup warming her hands against the morning chill. "You're early," she observed. "Best to work before the heat sets in." Daniel hefted a long plank onto his shoulder. "Coffee smells good." It was a hint, not a demand. Eleanor hesitated, then went inside and returned with a second cup, already filled. She handed it to him without comment. Daniel took it, sipped, and something like surprise crossed his face. "This is good coffee, real coffee, not the chicory blend most folks drink out here." "I brought it from Philadelphia, last of what I packed when we left." Eleanor looked into her own cup. Seemed wasteful to save it for special occasions, when every morning you wake up alive counts as special. Wise philosophy. He drank again, studying the well opening. "I'll need to go down first, check the stability, set supports before we continue digging. Should take most of the morning. I can help. You can hand me tools when I call for them and stay up here where it's safe." His tone was firm but not condescending. "That's how this works." Eleanor bristled, but before she could argue, Daniel added, "I lost my wife because I wasn't there when things went wrong, because I was out on range fixing fence when she went into labor early, and by the time I got back, they were both gone." His voice stayed level, but pain flickered across his face. "So humor me. Let me do the dangerous part while you do the essential part of staying alive for that baby." The honesty diffused her anger. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'll hand you tools, but I'm watching everything you do. Learning, because after you leave, I'll need to maintain this well myself." "Wouldn't expect anything less." Daniel set down his cup, began organizing equipment. "You strike me as someone who doesn't like depending on others." Depending on others gets you hurt when they leave, or die, or decide you're not worth the trouble anymore. Eleanor spoke flatly, stating facts without self-pity. Daniel glanced at her, those gray-blue eyes seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "Sounds like you've got history beyond losing your husband." "Everyone's got history, mine's just longer than most." She turned away. "What tools do you need first?" They worked through the morning in surprising harmony. Daniel descended into the well, called up for rope, for lumber, for the hammer and nails. Eleanor provided each item, lowering them carefully, watching how he positioned supports against the earthen walls, how he tested each board before trusting his weight to it. He worked with absolute focus, no wasted motion, no hesitation. This was a man who understood his craft completely. Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly, trusting that he knew what he was doing. Around noon, Daniel climbed out, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the coolness below ground. Eleanor had prepared a simple meal, biscuits made from her dwindling flour supply and strips of salted pork fried crisp. She'd told herself she was cooking for two because it was efficient, not because she felt obligated to feed someone helping her. They ate on the bench Marcus had built, not speaking, just consuming fuel to continue working. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that conversation wasn't always necessary. Finally, Daniel said, "The supports are solid now. We can start digging deeper this afternoon. If we hit water by tomorrow evening, I'll line the bottom with stones to keep it clean, show you how to maintain it. And then you'll leave." Eleanor wasn't asking. That was the agreement. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment. Having another person here, someone competent who didn't need constant direction or reassurance, had eased a loneliness she'd been refusing to acknowledge. "Your ranch," Eleanor said, changing the subject. 3 miles north, you said. You run it alone?" "I've got 2 hired men who help with the cattle. They handle most of the daily work while I manage the business side. It's not a large operation, but it's profitable enough." He paused. "Lonely, though. Big house, empty rooms. Sometimes I think about selling, moving somewhere less isolated. But you don't. But I don't, because my wife is buried there, because leaving feels like abandoning her twice." He stared at the horizon. "Grief is strange. It convinces you that staying in the place where you lost everything is somehow honoring what you had." Eleanor understood that completely. "I could have gone back to Philadelphia after Marcus died. My father sent a telegram offering to pay my passage if I admitted I'd been wrong to marry against his wishes. All I had to do was come home with my tail between my legs and agree to whatever future he arranged for me." "You refused." "I refused, because going back would mean Marcus died for nothing, would mean this claim, this life we were building, was just a failed experiment instead of something real." Her hand went to her belly. "And this baby deserves to grow up knowing their father chose something brave, even if it killed him." Not hearing that he was a mistake their grandfather barely tolerated. Daniel nodded slowly. "So we both stay in our hard places because leaving would dishonor the dead. Or because we're too stubborn to admit defeat," Eleanor suggested. "Maybe both." He stood, brushed crumbs from his pants. "Ready to get back to it?" They worked through the afternoon, Daniel in the well swinging the pickaxe, while Eleanor hauled up buckets of broken rock and clay. The system was efficient. He'd fill the bucket, she'd pull it up using the rope and pulley Daniel had rigged, dump the contents, lower the empty bucket back down. Her arms ached and her back screamed protest, but she kept working, driven by the same stubborn determination that had kept her digging alone before Daniel arrived. As the sun began its descent, Daniel called up from below, "Eleanor, come look at this." She moved carefully to the edge, peered down into the dimness. Daniel stood in the bottom of the well, his boots dark with moisture. "Hit the water table, it's seeping in already. By morning you'll have a functioning well." Relief so intense, it was almost painful, flooded through Eleanor. Water, clean, accessible water right here on her claim. One enormous problem solved. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Thank you, Daniel." He looked up at her, and in the fading light, she saw him smile. "You're welcome. Now help me get these tools up before it gets too dark to see." That evening, Eleanor insisted Daniel stay for supper. It seemed wrong to send him home after dark when he'd worked all day helping her. She prepared what she could, more biscuits, beans, the last of her coffee. They ate at the small table Marcus had built inside the cabin. Eleanor had lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back shadows and making the rough interior seem almost cozy. "You've done well with this place," Daniel observed, looking around at the neat organization, the supplies carefully stored, the space maximized despite the cabin's small size. "Most homesteaders live in chaos for the first year." "I can't afford chaos," Chaos means losing track of supplies, wasting food, missing problems before they become crises. Eleanor refilled his coffee cup. My father ran his bank the same way. Everything documented, everything in its place, no room for disorder. He sounds difficult. He was exacting, is exacting, I suppose, since he's still alive and still running his bank with the same iron control. She sipped her own coffee. We're similar, him and I. Same stubborn refusal to bend. Same conviction that we're right and everyone else is wrong. That's why we couldn't coexist. Two people that rigid in the same space just shatter each other. Daniel considered this. Your husband, Marcus? He was different? Completely. He was flexible, optimistic, convinced that everything would work out if we just kept trying. Eleanor's voice softened. He balanced me, made me less rigid. I made him more practical. We were good together, even when we were struggling. Sarah was like that for me, Daniel said quietly, always finding joy in small things. She could make an adventure out of gathering eggs or mending fence. I was too serious, too focused on work and building the ranch. She reminded me to actually live in the life we were creating. They sat in companionable silence, two people united by loss and the strange comfort of being understood without explanation. Finally, Daniel said, I should go. Early start tomorrow to finish up. You could stay. The words came out before Eleanor fully considered them. In the barn, I mean. There's clean hay, it's warm, and it would save you riding back in the dark and returning at dawn. Daniel studied her carefully. You sure about that? Might set tongues wagging if anyone notices. There's no one close enough to notice, and frankly, I stopped caring about propriety around the time I started digging wells while 7 months pregnant. Eleanor stood, began clearing dishes. It's practical, that's all. Saves time and effort. Practical, Daniel repeated, with the hint of a smile. All right then, I accept your practical offer. He helped her wash dishes, unexpected and appreciated, then took his bedroll to the barn while Eleanor prepared for bed in the cabin. She lay in the darkness, the baby shifting restlessly inside her, and thought about how strange it was to have another person nearby. How the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone made the night feel less oppressive. She'd protected her independence fiercely since Marcus died, convinced that needing anyone was weakness. But maybe there was a difference between needing someone and accepting help from someone capable of giving it. Maybe Daniel was right that some people helped without expecting payment. That not every kindness came with invisible strings. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Eleanor whispered into the darkness, Your father would have liked him, would have appreciated someone willing to help without making a fuss about it. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Eleanor woke confused. She hadn't made coffee yet, and then remembered Daniel sleeping in the barn, apparently already awake and working. She dressed quickly and went outside to find him crouched beside the well, lowering a bucket down and pulling it back up, testing the water level. It filled overnight, he announced, genuine satisfaction in his voice. Clean water, good flow. This well will serve you through winter and beyond. Eleanor joined him, looked down at the dark water reflecting morning light. Marcus had started this well. Daniel had finished it, and she would use it to keep herself and her child alive. The continuity felt significant, like a chain of kindness linking past to future. I'll line the bottom with stones today, Daniel continued, show you how to keep it maintained. Then my work here is done. Right, our agreement. Eleanor tried to keep her voice neutral. 2 days, then you leave. That's what we said. Daniel stood, wiped his hands on his pants. Unless you've changed your mind about wanting help. Eleanor opened her mouth to say no, to reaffirm her independence, to send him away as planned. But what came out was, The cabin roof leaks. Marcus was supposed to fix it before winter, but he never got the chance. And there's fence that needs mending on the south boundary, and... She stopped, horrified at herself. She was asking for more help, admitting she couldn't do everything alone. Daniel's expression didn't change. I could fix the roof. Take maybe 3 days. The fence, another 2 after that, if you wanted. I can't keep accepting your help without giving anything in return. Then don't accept it as charity. Accept it as neighboring. I help you with projects too big for one person. You help me when I need an extra pair of hands during calving season or harvest. That's how it works out here. People help each other because that's how everyone survives. The logic was sound. The offer was reasonable. And Eleanor was so tired of carrying everything alone. All right, she said quietly. Neighboring, that's acceptable. Daniel smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something unexpectedly warm. Good, then let's finish this well properly before we move on to your roof. They worked through the morning, Daniel descending one final time to line the well bottom with carefully chosen stones, creating a stable base that would keep the water clean. Eleanor assisted from above, lowering materials, watching the process so she could maintain it herself later. When he finally climbed out, muddy and exhausted but satisfied, Eleanor had lunch ready, the last of her bread and some preserved vegetables she'd been hoarding. You're feeding me your reserves, Daniel observed, looking at the simple meal. You've earned it, and I'll need to go to town for supplies soon anyway. Might as well use what I have before it spoils. I'm heading to town in 3 days. You could come with me, save yourself the trip alone. Another offer, another small yielding of her fierce independence. Eleanor considered refusing, then thought about the long ride to town, the heavy supplies she'd need to carry back, the exhaustion that came now from efforts that wouldn't have winded her 6 months ago. That would be helpful, she admitted. Thank you. They ate in comfortable silence, and Eleanor realized something had shifted. She wasn't just accepting help anymore. She was accepting Daniel's presence, his steady competence, the strange ease of having someone who understood loss without needing it explained. The well was finished, but Daniel wasn't leaving yet. And Eleanor discovered she was glad. The roof repair revealed problems Eleanor hadn't known existed. Daniel climbed up the first morning with his tools and came back down shaking his head, his expression grim. It's not just leaking, he said, standing beside the ladder. 3 of the support beams are rotting. The whole structure is compromised. We need to replace them before winter, or you'll have the roof come down on you during the first heavy snow. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. How long will that take? A week, maybe more. And we'll need lumber I don't have on hand. I'll need to place an order in town, have it freighted out. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor, this is going to cost money. Materials aren't cheap, and the freight charges. I don't have money. She said it flatly, without shame. I spent everything I had left on Marcus's funeral and filing fees for the claim. I've got maybe $12 to my name, and I need that for food to last until spring. Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. All right, here's what we do. I front the lumber costs, and you pay me back after you've proved up the claim and can take out a loan against the property. Or you work it off helping at my ranch when the baby's old enough. Either way, we make it fair. That could take years to repay. Then it takes years. I'm not going anywhere. He met her eyes steadily. Eleanor, you need this roof fixed. That's not negotiable. We can argue about payment terms later, but right now, we need to keep you and that baby from freezing to death come December. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the fiction that she could handle everything herself, but the baby chose that moment to kick hard enough to make her gasp and press a hand to her ribs. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. Order the lumber. I'll find a way to repay you." "I know you will." Daniel's voice held absolute certainty. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. If you say you'll do something, I believe you." While they waited for the lumber to arrive, a process that would take nearly 2 weeks, Daniel turned his attention to other repairs. The chicken coop Marcus had started but never finished, the barn door that hung crooked on broken hinges, the garden plot that needed tilling before it could be planted for winter vegetables. Eleanor worked alongside him when she could, though her pregnant body limited what tasks she could manage. She felt increasingly awkward and slow, her center of gravity shifting daily as the baby grew. Simple things like bending to pick up tools or climbing over fence rails became major undertakings. Daniel never commented on her limitations, just quietly adjusted tasks to accommodate what she could do. When she couldn't lift heavy boards, he handed her the hammer and nails and let her do the detail work. When she couldn't climb ladders, he brought projects down to ground level, where she could reach them. It was considerate without being patronizing, and Eleanor found herself grateful in ways she couldn't quite articulate. 3 days after finishing the well, Daniel made good on his offer to take Eleanor to town. She dressed in her cleanest clothes, which still meant work worn and patched, and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him with considerable effort. The ride to Clearwater took 2 hours across rough terrain. Daniel kept the horses to a steady pace, avoiding the worst ruts, clearly conscious of Eleanor's condition. They didn't talk much, just watched the landscape roll past. Endless grassland broken by rocky outcroppings and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking underground water. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said finally. "I didn't think so when we first arrived. I thought it was desolate and harsh. But there's something about all this space, all this sky. It gets into you." Sarah said the same thing. She was from St. Louis originally, used to buildings and crowds. First year out here, she cried every night from loneliness. By the second year, she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Daniel's voice held the distant quality it always took when he spoke of his wife. She said the silence taught her to hear herself think, that the emptiness made room for becoming whoever she wanted to be. Was she happy before she died? Very. We both were. He glanced at Eleanor. Were you? Happy with Marcus before the accident? Eleanor considered the question honestly. Happy isn't quite the right word. We struggled constantly. Money was always tight. The work was backbreaking. We argued about everything from how to build the cabin to whether we should have come west at all. But we were building something together. There was satisfaction in that, even when we were exhausted and scared. She touched her belly. And then this happened, and suddenly everything felt possible, like all the struggle had purpose beyond just surviving. That's what children do. They make the future matter in a way it didn't before. Clearwater was hardly more than a dozen buildings clustered around a dusty main street, but to Eleanor it represented civilization after weeks of isolation. The general store, the land office, a saloon, a church, a boarding house that served meals to travelers. Daniel pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and helped Eleanor down with a steadying hand. Inside, the proprietor, a lean man named Whitaker, with sharp eyes and a ledger book that tracked everyone's debts, looked up from his counter. Crawford, haven't seen you in a few weeks. His gaze shifted to Eleanor, taking in her condition with poorly concealed curiosity. Ma'am. Mr. Whitaker, I need to place an order for supplies. Eleanor pulled out her carefully prepared list, determined to handle this transaction herself. Whitaker took the list, scanned it, and began tallying numbers. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, lamp oil comes to $8.40. You paying cash or credit? Cash. Eleanor counted out bills and coins from her small purse. watching her meager savings disappear. "You're Marcus Hayes's widow," Whitaker said, not quite a question. "Heard about his accident. Shame. He seemed like a decent fellow." "He was." Eleanor kept her voice neutral, refusing to invite further commentary. "You planning to stay on that claim? Winter's coming, and that's a hard place for a woman alone, especially one in your condition." Whitaker's tone suggested he thought she was being foolish. "I'm proving up the claim as required. My personal situation doesn't affect the legal requirements." Eleanor took her change, began gathering the smaller items while Whitaker's assistant loaded the heavier goods into the wagon. Just saying might be smarter to sell while you can still get something for it. Widow trying to work a homestead alone, people will talk. "Let them talk." Eleanor turned to leave, then paused. "And I'm not alone. Mr. Crawford has been kind enough to assist with projects requiring 2 people. That's called neighboring, Mr. Whitaker. Perhaps you've heard of it." Outside, Daniel was loading the 50-pound sack of flour into the wagon bed. He looked up as Eleanor emerged, clearly having heard at least part of the exchange through the open door. "Whitaker always this charming?" Eleanor asked dryly. "He's gotten worse since his wife left him last year. Turns out being perpetually suspicious and judgmental isn't attractive in a husband." Daniel secured the flour. "Don't let him get to you. Half the people in this territory thought Sarah and I were crazy for settling where we did. The other half thought we wouldn't last a year. We proved them wrong." "Until she died." "Until she died," Daniel agreed quietly. "But that didn't make them right. Just made us unlucky." They completed the rest of Eleanor's errands, stopping at the land office to confirm her claim status, purchasing a few yards of fabric at the dry goods store for baby clothes Eleanor would need to sew, and were preparing to leave when a woman's voice called out, "Daniel Crawford, is that really you?" They turned to see a woman approaching, perhaps 35, dressed in a wine-colored dress far too fine for Clearwater's dusty street. She was beautiful in a deliberate way, carefully arranged hair, painted lips, a figure that drew eyes even in a town this small. Daniel's expression closed off. "Margaret, I didn't know you were in town." "Just arrived yesterday. I'm visiting my sister." Margaret's gaze slid to Eleanor with undisguised assessment. "And who is this?" "Eleanor Hayes. She has the homestead claim south of my property." Daniel's voice was carefully neutral. "Eleanor, this is Margaret Sutton. We knew each other some years back." The way Margaret smiled suggested knew each other was a significant understatement. "Daniel and I were engaged once, before he met Sarah and decided frontier life was more appealing than Boston society." There was acid beneath the sweet tone. "I decided Sarah was more appealing than a woman who wanted me to be someone I wasn't," Daniel corrected quietly. "But that was a long time ago, Margaret. I hope you've been well." "Well enough, though I hear you've been quite the hermit since Sarah's death. People worry about you, Daniel, alone on that ranch, refusing all social invitations." Her eyes returned to Eleanor. "But perhaps you're not so alone after all." The implication was clear and offensive. Eleanor felt her face heat with anger, but before she could respond, Daniel said coldly, "Mrs. Hayes is my neighbor and friend. She recently lost her husband and is working her claim while expecting a child. I've been helping with repairs too heavy for one person to manage. That's all, and it's none of your business regardless." "Of course, I meant no offense." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "Though you must admit, Daniel, appearances matter. A widower spending time alone with a pregnant widow, people will draw their own conclusions. Then people are fools." Daniel took Eleanor's elbow. "Excuse us, Margaret. We have a long ride home." He helped Eleanor into the wagon with more force than strictly necessary, climbed up beside her and snapped the reins. They left Clearwater at a faster pace than they'd arrived, the horses sensing their driver's mood. After a mile of tense silence, Eleanor said, "You don't have to explain about her. Margaret is poison, always was. She wanted me to give up ranching and move back east, take over her father's textile business. When I refused, she made it her mission to convince everyone I was throwing away my future for a foolish dream." Daniel's hands were tight on the reins. "Then I met Sarah, and Margaret couldn't stand that I'd chosen someone else, someone real, instead of her calculated performance of what a wife should be. She's still angry. She's bitter. There's a difference." He glanced at Eleanor. "And she'll spread rumors now about you and me, about what she thinks is happening between us." Eleanor absorbed this, feeling her carefully constructed independence cracking under the weight of other people's assumptions. "Maybe you should stop helping me. If it's going to damage your reputation, I don't give a damn about my reputation, and neither should you." Daniel's voice was fierce. "We're doing nothing wrong, nothing shameful. Let Margaret and everyone else think whatever they want. We know the truth. The truth doesn't matter if enough people believe the lie. Then we make sure our actions speak louder than their gossip." He met her eyes. "Eleanor, I'm not abandoning you because some bitter woman from my past wants to cause trouble. You need help. I can provide it. That's the beginning and end of the story." Eleanor wanted to believe him, wanted to think that their strange friendship could exist outside the judgment of people who didn't understand it. But she'd lived long enough to know how powerful whispers could become, how easily reputations were destroyed by nothing more than strategic implication. "What if it affects the land claim?" she asked quietly. "What if someone challenges it based on my morals or fitness to prove up?" Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then, "We'll deal with that if it happens. But Eleanor, you can't live your life afraid of what small-minded people might think. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to satisfy everyone's idea of propriety." He was right. Eleanor knew he was right, but the fear lingered, cold and insistent, in her chest. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Eleanor's claim, Daniel helped her unload supplies, stacking everything carefully inside the cabin. "I should go," he said when they'd finished. "Give you some space. I'll come back when the lumber arrives to start on the roof." "Daniel," Eleanor stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "Thank you" felt insufficient. "I'm sorry, seemed wrong. I'm glad you didn't listen to Margaret about abandoning foolish dreams." He smiled, tired but genuine. "So am I. Sarah and I had 5 good years together. That's more than some people get in a lifetime." After he left, Eleanor stood in her cabin surrounded by the supplies that would keep her alive through autumn, and thought about the complicated mathematics of human connection. How helping someone could be simultaneously simple and fraught with consequence. How kindness could be misconstrued as something darker by people determined to see shadows everywhere. The baby moved inside her, a reminder that time was running short. In 2 months, maybe less, she'd be a mother, alone on this claim with an infant and winter approaching, unless she wasn't alone. Unless Daniel continued helping, continued being the steady presence that made impossible tasks feel achievable. But at what cost? To his reputation, to her claim, to the fragile friendship they'd built. Eleanor didn't have answers. She only had questions, and the growing certainty that nothing about frontier life was as straightforward as she'd imagined when she'd left Philadelphia full of romantic ideals about Western freedom. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. Eleanor closed the cabin door against it and tried to convince herself that she could handle whatever came next, alone if necessary, but hoping, despite everything, that she wouldn't have to be. The lumber arrived on a Thursday, hauled out by freight wagon along with a message from Daniel saying he'd come the following morning to begin work. Eleanor spent the evening organizing the boards, running her hands over the smooth pine that would become her roof, her shelter against winter. She didn't let herself think about the debt she was accumulating, didn't calculate how many years it might take to repay Daniel for materials and labor. The numbers were too daunting, and dwelling on them would only paralyze her with anxiety she couldn't afford. That night, the first real storm of autumn rolled across the plains. Eleanor woke to thunder that shook the cabin walls and rain hammering the inadequate roof with violence that suggested nature's personal vendetta. Water dripped through in 3 places, one directly over the table, another near the stove, a third pooling in the corner where she'd stored grain. She scrambled out of bed, grabbed every pot and bucket she owned, positioned them under the leaks. The grain she moved to the driest corner, praying it wouldn't mold before she could use it. The storm raged for hours, wind screaming around the cabin's corners, rain finding every gap and weakness in Marcus's construction. By morning, Eleanor was exhausted and soaked. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnaturally bright, but her cabin looked like a disaster. Puddles everywhere, her bedding damp, the carefully organized supplies disrupted by her frantic midnight rearrangement. She was trying to wring water from her blanket when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Daniel appeared around the side of the cabin, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Are you all right? I saw the storm from my place and knew your roof." He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. "Christ, Eleanor, it's fine. I managed." She wrung more water from the blanket, refusing to meet his eyes. "Just a little wet." "A little wet." Daniel stepped inside, began assessing the damage. "Your mattress is soaked through. This grain is already starting to smell. And is that mold on the wall?" Eleanor looked where he pointed and felt despair settle over her like a heavy coat. Yes. Dark spots spreading across the cabin's interior wall where water had pooled and sat all night. Mold that would spread, that would make the air unhealthy, especially for a newborn. "We need to strip this all out," Daniel said, already moving. "Get everything outside to dry. I'll tear out that section of wall, replace it before the mold spreads. And we're starting on the roof today, weather be damned. I'm not having you spend another night under a structure that's actively trying to drown you. You said it would take a week to fix the roof properly. Then we'll work faster. I'll bring my hired men tomorrow. They can handle things at the ranch for a few days." He was already hauling Eleanor's soaked mattress toward the door. "Come on, help me get this outside." They worked through the morning, emptying the cabin of everything that had gotten wet. Eleanor's clothes, her bedding, supplies, even the small trunk where she kept her few precious items from Philadelphia. Everything went outside to dry in the unexpected sunshine. The cabin looked skeletal, stripped bare, just rough walls and floor and the gaps where water had invaded. Daniel examined the rotted support beams with a critical eye, running his hands over wood that crumbled at his touch. "This is worse than I thought. Marcus must have used green lumber, wood that wasn't properly dried. It looked fine initially, but moisture got in and started the rot." He shook his head. He didn't know. Most people don't when they're building their first structure, but it means we're essentially rebuilding your entire roof from scratch. Eleanor sank onto the one chair that had stayed dry. "How much will that cost?" "More than we planned, but Eleanor, it has to be done. This isn't optional anymore." "I know." She pressed both hands to her belly, where the baby was moving restlessly, disturbed by her stress. I had a plan. Prove up the claim, build slowly, create something stable before the baby came. And instead, everything is falling apart faster than I can fix it." Daniel crouched in front of her, his weathered face serious. Listen to me. You're not alone in this. I know you want to be. I know you've built your whole identity around not needing anyone. But right now, today, you need help, and I'm offering it. Not as charity, not as something you have to grovel for or repay with interest. Just as one person helping another because it's the right thing to do. Why? The question came out raw. Why do you care this much about someone you barely know? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, because when Sarah was dying, I wasn't there. I was out on the range doing work that could have waited, and she went into labor early and there was no one to help her. By the time I got back, they were both gone. His voice cracked. I can't fix that, can't bring them back or change what happened. But I can make sure another woman in trouble doesn't suffer alone because everyone around her decided her problems weren't their concern. The honesty of it stripped away Eleanor's defenses. She reached out, covered his hand with hers. I'm sorry for your loss and for being too proud to accept help gracefully. You're accepting it now. That's what matters. He stood, squeezed her hand briefly before releasing it. Now, I need you to do something for me. Go to my ranch. Stay there while we fix this roof. You can't sleep in a wet cabin with mold growing on the walls, and I won't have you trying. Daniel, I can't just move into your house. You're not moving in. You're staying temporarily while repairs happen. There's a guest room that hasn't been used since Sarah's sister visited 3 years ago. It's clean, dry, and has a real bed. You'll be safe there. He forestalled her protest. And before you mention Margaret Sutton's gossip, consider this. Would you rather deal with rumors or risk your baby's health by staying in a moldy cabin? Put that way, there was no argument. Eleanor's own comfort and reputation meant nothing compared to the child she carried. How long will the repairs take? With my men helping, maybe 5 days for the roof and wall, then another day to make sure everything's dry and sealed before you move back in. Daniel collected his tools. Pack what you need. I'll ride back with you now, get you settled, then return here to start work. Eleanor gathered her few dry possessions, a change of clothes, her journal, the small photograph of Marcus she kept wrapped in cloth. Everything fit in a single saddlebag, a testament to how little she'd managed to accumulate in her time on the frontier. The ride to Daniel's ranch took 40 minutes. Eleanor had never seen his property before, and she was surprised by its scale. A large barn in good repair, several outbuildings, a corral with a dozen horses, and at the center, a 2-story house painted white with green shutters and a wraparound porch. It looked solid, permanent, like the kind of home people built when they intended to stay forever. Sarah designed it, Daniel said, seeing Eleanor's expression. She had specific ideas about windows and light, about how a house should feel. I just did what she told me and tried not to argue too much. Inside was even more impressive. Real furniture, not cobbled together from crates and boards, curtains on the windows, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that must have cost a fortune to freight out, books on shelves, paintings on walls, all the accumulated details of a life being built with intention and care. The guest room is upstairs, second door on the left, Daniel said. I'll show you. He led her up a staircase with a polished banister, down a hallway with framed photographs of people Eleanor didn't recognize. The guest room was simple but comfortable. A real bed with a quilted coverlet, a dresser with a mirror, a window overlooking the front pasture. Washroom is across the hall. There's a pump in the kitchen for water. Help yourself to anything in the pantry. I've got more food than one person needs. Daniel set her saddlebag on the bed. Make yourself at home, Eleanor. This isn't charity. It's just common sense. After he left, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the exhaustion she'd been fighting for weeks. The mattress was soft. The room was warm, and for the first time since Marcus died, she felt physically safe. She unpacked her few belongings, then explored the house with guilty curiosity. The kitchen was well stocked, as Daniel had promised. The parlor held comfortable chairs and more books than Eleanor had seen in months. And everywhere, small reminders of the woman who'd lived here. A vase that looked handmade, embroidered pillows, a child's drawing framed on the wall as if it were precious art. Sarah had made this house a home. And then she'd died, leaving Daniel alone in all this careful beauty. Eleanor understood with sudden clarity why he'd been so quick to help her. He was trying to fill the emptiness, trying to make Sarah's vision of hospitality and kindness continue even without her here to embody it. That evening, Eleanor cooked supper using Daniel's supplies, a proper meal with vegetables from his root cellar and meat from his smokehouse. When he returned, exhausted and filthy from a day of tearing out rotted roof supports, she had food waiting and coffee brewed. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the table she'd set. "You didn't have to do this. You're letting me stay in your home. Cooking a meal is the least I can do." Eleanor ladled stew into bowls. Besides, it felt good to cook in a real kitchen again. Marcus and I were making do with such limited equipment. They ate together, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into conversation that felt increasingly natural. Daniel told her about the progress on her roof, about his hired men's reactions to being reassigned to cabin repair. She told him about the book she'd been reading, about her plans for the garden once spring came. It felt dangerously domestic, like they were two people sharing a life rather than two grieving strangers offering mutual assistance. After supper, Daniel retreated to his study to handle ranch accounts, while Eleanor washed dishes. She was drying the last plate when she felt it, a sharp, tight pain low in her belly that made her gasp and grip the counter. It passed after a moment, leaving her breathless. Probably nothing, the baby shifting position or her body adjusting to the additional weight. She'd felt similar pains before, but an hour later, lying in the guest bed, it happened again. Stronger this time, radiating across her abdomen in a wave that felt wrong. Too early. The baby wasn't due for 2 more months. Eleanor tried to breathe through it, tried to stay calm. False labor, perhaps. She'd read about that, the body practicing for the real thing. The third contraction came 30 minutes later, and this time she couldn't suppress a cry of pain. Footsteps in the hallway, then Daniel's voice through the door. "Eleanor, are you all right?" "I don't know." She struggled to sit up. "I'm having pains. They might be contractions." The door opened, propriety forgotten in the face of medical emergency. Daniel crossed to the bed, his face pale. "How far apart?" 20 or 30. "Minutes. They started about 2 hours ago." "That's too early. The baby's not due yet." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly trying to think. "We need to get you to a doctor. There's one in Clearwater, but that's 2 hours away in good conditions. At night, on rough roads, with you in labor. It might not be real labor. It might stop." But even as Eleanor said it, another contraction hit, harder than the others, stealing her breath and making her curl forward with pain. Daniel swore quietly. "I'm getting you to Clearwater. Can you ride in the wagon?" "I don't have a choice." He moved with swift efficiency, gathering blankets and pillows to make the wagon bed as comfortable as possible. Eleanor dressed with shaking hands, fighting panic. 2 months early was dangerous. Babies born that premature often didn't survive. And even if this child lived, what kind of life could Eleanor give an infant with special needs, alone on a struggling homestead? The ride to Clearwater was agony. Every rut in the road sent pain shooting through Eleanor's body. The contractions grew closer together, 20 minutes, then 15, then 10. She lay in the wagon bed, gripping the sides, trying not to scream. Daniel pushed the horses harder than was safe, his face set in grim determination. He kept calling back to her, "Hold on, Eleanor, just hold on. We're almost there." But almost wasn't fast enough. 5 miles from town, Eleanor felt something give way inside her, felt a warm rush of fluid that meant there was no stopping this now. The baby was coming whether anyone was ready or not. "Daniel," her voice was weak, "I can't wait, the baby's coming now." He pulled the horses to a stop, climbed into the wagon bed beside her. In the moonlight, his face was pale but steady. All right, we'll manage this. Sarah's sister was a midwife. She taught me some things in case of emergency. I can help you." "You can't, you're not." Eleanor broke off as another contraction hit, harder and longer than any before. "I can and I will." Daniel's voice was firm. "Eleanor, look at me. You're not doing this alone. I'm right here and I'm not leaving. We're going to bring this baby into the world together and we're both going to survive it. Do you hear me?" Eleanor met his eyes and found absolute certainty there. This man who'd lost his own wife and child in circumstances exactly like this wasn't going to let history repeat itself. "I hear you," she whispered. "Good. Now, when the next contraction comes, I need you to push." The night dissolved into pain and effort, and Daniel's steady voice guiding her through each impossible moment. He'd positioned blankets beneath her, created as much privacy and comfort as a wagon bed allowed. His hands were gentle but sure, and his calm never wavered, even when Eleanor was certain she was dying. "You're doing perfectly," he kept saying, "strong and brave. Just a little more." Time lost meaning. There was only the cycle of contraction, pushing, breathing, then starting again. Eleanor's world narrowed to Daniel's face above her and the overwhelming instinct to bring this child safely into the world. And then, with a final push that tore a scream from her throat, the baby came, small and slick and terrifyingly silent. Daniel caught the infant, his hands impossibly large around the tiny body. For one horrible moment, nothing happened. No cry, no movement. Then the baby gasped, let out a thin wail that grew stronger, and Eleanor collapsed back against the blankets, sobbing with relief. "It's a girl," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a daughter, Eleanor." He wrapped the baby in clean cloth, cut and tied the cord with steady hands, then placed the tiny bundle on Eleanor's chest. The infant was so small, weeks early and fragile, but her eyes were open and she was breathing and she was alive. "Hello," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, little one. You're early, but you're here. You're really here." Daniel sat back, his shirt stained with blood and his hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. "She needs a doctor. You both do. I'll get us to town." But he didn't move immediately, just sat there in the wagon bed, watching Eleanor hold her daughter, and Eleanor saw him wipe at his eyes with the back of one hand. "Thank you," she said. "Daniel, thank you. If you hadn't been there, I was there. That's what matters." He stood, moved back to the driver's seat. "Let's get you both somewhere warm and safe." The rest of the ride passed in a daze. Eleanor held her daughter close, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest, marveling that something so small could be so perfect. The baby had all her fingers and toes, a shock of dark hair and Marcus's nose. She was early and underweight and would need careful watching, but she was alive. They reached Clearwater just before dawn. Dr. Morrison, roused from sleep by Daniel's pounding on his door, examined both Eleanor and the baby with professional efficiency. "She's small," he said, "but her lungs sound good and she's nursing. That's a positive sign. You'll need to keep her warm, feed her frequently, watch for any signs of distress. But I think she'll make it, Mrs. Hayes. Your daughter is a fighter." Eleanor, lying in the doctor's spare bedroom with her daughter wrapped in borrowed blankets, felt exhaustion and joy and terror all warring in her chest. Daniel appeared in the doorway, looking nearly as exhausted as Eleanor felt. "The doctor says you both need to rest here for a few days. I'll stay in town, check on you, handle anything that needs handling. You should go back to the ranch. You have work. The work can wait. You can't. He came closer, looked down at the sleeping infant. She's beautiful, Eleanor. What will you name her? Eleanor thought about her life before. Philadelphia, her father's house, the girl she'd been who thought she understood the world. Then she thought about Marcus, about the life they'd tried to build together. And finally she thought about this moment, about the man who'd refused to let her face the darkness alone. Grace, she said quietly. Her name is Grace, for undeserved gifts and second chances. Daniel smiled, and it transformed his tired face into something warm and genuine. Grace Hayes, it suits her perfectly. He stayed for a moment longer, then left to let Eleanor rest. But before he closed the door, he said, "You were incredibly brave tonight. Sarah would have liked you, I think. Would have been glad I found someone worth helping." Then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with her daughter. With Grace, who'd arrived 2 months early in the bed of a wagon, delivered by a widowed rancher who understood loss and welcomed into a world that was hard and uncertain, but also, sometimes, surprisingly kind. Eleanor looked down at her daughter's sleeping face and whispered, "We made it, little one. Against all odds, we made it." Outside, dawn was breaking over Clearwater, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day, a new life. A new beginning neither of them could have imagined just months ago. And somewhere in that uncertain future, Eleanor could finally see a path forward that didn't end in surrender or defeat. A path that included this child, this claim, and maybe, just maybe, the steady presence of a man who'd proven that kindness wasn't weakness, and accepting help wasn't the same as giving up. Eleanor stayed in Clearwater for 8 days. Dr. Morrison insisted on monitoring Grace closely, watching for any complications from her premature birth. The baby remained small but grew stronger each day, her cries becoming more robust, her appetite improving. Daniel visited twice daily, bringing supplies Eleanor needed and news from her claim. The roof was nearly finished, he reported. His men had replaced all the rotted supports and were now installing the new boards. The moldy wall section had been torn out and rebuilt. In another few days, the cabin would be ready for her return. "You don't have to keep updating me," Eleanor said one afternoon, sitting in the doctor's parlor with Grace sleeping in her arms. "I trust you're handling things properly." "I know you trust me. I'm telling you anyway because it's your home and you have a right to know what's being done to it." Daniel sat across from her, his hat in his hands. "Besides, it gives me an excuse to check on you both." Eleanor studied him, this man who'd become central to her survival without her quite noticing when it happened. "Why do you keep doing this? The roof, the repairs, staying in town to watch over us. You've got your own ranch to run, your own life to live." "I told you why. Because I couldn't save Sarah and my son. But I can help you and Grace. Because leaving you to struggle alone when I have the means to help would make me the kind of man I don't want to be." He met her eyes. "And if I'm being completely honest, because having people to care about again makes me feel less like a ghost, haunting my own life." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Eleanor shifted Grace to her other arm, choosing her words carefully. "When we go back to the claim, things will have to change. The gossip Margaret Sutton started, it's only going to get worse once people know you delivered my baby, that you've been staying in town to watch over us. Let them talk." "Daniel, it's not just talk. It could affect my ability to prove up the claim. If someone challenges my moral fitness, points to our friendship as evidence of impropriety, I could lose everything." Eleanor's voice tightened. "I can't let that happen." Grace deserves better than to grow up watching her mother lose the only security we have, because people decided we were scandalous. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, "There's a way to solve that problem. Not an easy way, maybe not even a way you'd want, but a solution nonetheless." Eleanor waited, her heart beginning to pound. "Marry me," Daniel said simply. "Legal and proper. Give Grace my name. Make yourself Mrs. Crawford. Let people think whatever they want because we'll have done everything correctly by their standards." Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. Think about it practically. You need help proving up your claim and raising Grace. I have resources, experience, and a house with empty rooms that could use filling. We get along well enough. We respect each other. That's more than a lot of marriages start with." "That's insane. We barely know each other." "We know each other well enough. I've seen you at your worst, desperate and scared and covered in mud. You've seen me at mine, grieving and withdrawn and probably drinking too much some nights. There are no illusions left to shatter." He leaned forward. "Eleanor, I'm not proposing romance. I'm proposing partnership. Two people who understand loss and survival, helping each other build something stable." Eleanor looked down at Grace, at her daughter's perfect, small face. She thought about the cabin that was only habitable because Daniel had made it so. About the well she couldn't have finished alone. About giving birth in a wagon bed with only this man's steady hands and voice keeping her from panic. "What would you expect from me? As a wife?" The question came out barely above a whisper. "Nothing you're not willing to give. Separate rooms, if that's what you want. Your claim stays in your name. I'll help you prove it up. But the land remains yours. We run our properties independently but support each other when needed." He paused. "What I'm offering is protection, Eleanor. Legal standing, a father's name for Grace, security against anyone who wants to challenge your fitness or your claim. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Company, purpose, a reason to fix up that house for people who will actually live in it rather than just me rattling around alone." His voice softened. "And maybe, if we're lucky, friendship that grows into something more over time. But there's no pressure, no expectations. Just two people choosing to face the hard parts of life together instead of separately." Eleanor's mind raced through implications and consequences. Marriage to Daniel would solve her immediate problems, the gossip, the financial strain, the impossible logistics of proving up a claim while caring for an infant alone. But it would also bind her to another person, surrender the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. Then Grace stirred in her arms, making small, hungry sounds, and Eleanor thought about all the nights ahead, all the 2 a.m. feedings and colic and teething, all the times she'd be exhausted and desperate and completely overwhelmed, all the moments when having another adult present wouldn't just be helpful but essential. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need." Daniel stood, settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be at the boarding house if you want to talk more. No pressure, Eleanor. Whatever you decide, I'll still help you get back on your feet. The offer stands independent of your answer." After he left, Eleanor sat with Grace and tried to think rationally, but rational thought kept colliding with the memory of Daniel's hands delivering her daughter, his voice keeping her grounded through pain and fear, his absolute refusal to let her face crisis alone. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, medical bag in hand. "Time to check on our littlest patient. How's she doing?" "Eating well, sleeping in stretches, getting stronger, I think." Eleanor handed Grace over for examination. The doctor listened to the baby's heart, checked her breathing, palpated her small belly with practiced gentleness. She's doing remarkably well for a premature infant. You're doing well too, Mrs. Hayes, better than most women would after childbirth in a wagon. I had help. Daniel Crawford knew what to do. So I heard. Lucky for you, he was there. Dr. Morrison handed Grace back. Also lucky he's a good man. Not many would have handled that situation with such propriety. Eleanor looked up sharply. People are already talking, aren't they? Small town. People always talk. The doctor's expression was kind. But for what it's worth, the talk I've heard is admiring, not condemning. Crawford delivered your baby in an emergency and got you both to safety. That takes skill and courage. Anyone suggesting something improper happened is showing their own small mind, not revealing truth about either of you. After the doctor left, Eleanor nursed Grace and thought about reputations and rumors and the impossible standards women were held to. She thought about Margaret Sutton's insinuations and the way Whitaker at the general store had looked at her, already judging her fitness as a widow alone. She thought about Daniel's proposal, practical, honest, offering protection without demanding surrender. By evening, she'd made her decision. She found Daniel at the boarding house, sitting in the common room reading a newspaper that was 3 weeks old. He looked up when she entered, Grace bundled in blankets and sleeping against Eleanor's shoulder. "Can we talk?" Eleanor asked. "Somewhere private?" He led her to a small parlor the boarding house kept for guests, closed the door to give them privacy. Eleanor settled into a chair, adjusted Grace's blankets, then met Daniel's gaze directly. "I'll marry you," she said, "on certain conditions." Something that might have been relief crossed Daniel's face. "Name them." "First, my claim stays mine. You help me prove it up, but the deed remains in my name. I need to know that if something happens, if you die or we decide this arrangement isn't working, I still have land and security for Grace." "Agreed. That was already my intention." "Second, we maintain separate finances. What's yours stays yours, what's mine stays mine. I won't be dependent on your generosity or have you control my money the way my father controlled my mother's." "Also agreed. I'll help you establish an account at the bank in your own name." "Third," Eleanor paused, gathering courage, "this marriage is a partnership, not ownership. I won't be ordered around or told what I can and can't do. My decisions regarding Grace are mine to make, and if I say no to anything, anything at all, that answer is respected without question or pressure." Daniel nodded slowly. "Eleanor, I'm not interested in owning you or controlling you. I've seen what that kind of marriage looks like, and it's poison. What I want is a partner, someone I can rely on who can rely on me. Equal standing, equal say. You have my word on that." "Then yes, I'll marry you." Eleanor felt the words settle over her like a coat, slightly uncomfortable, not quite fitting right yet, but providing necessary warmth. "When?" "Soon as you're ready to travel. We can get married in Clearwater, file the papers properly, then head back to the ranch. Your cabin's finished, but I'd prefer you and Grace stay at the main house, at least through winter. Easier to manage a newborn with proper heat and space." "That's practical," Eleanor admitted. "We can revisit in spring when Grace is older." "Exactly. Partnership means adapting to circumstances, not rigid adherence to pride." Daniel stood, extended his hand formally. "So we have an agreement, Mrs. Hayes, soon to be Mrs. Crawford?" Eleanor shook his hand, felt the calloused strength of his grip. "We have an agreement." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the Clearwater Church. Dr. Morrison served as witness, along with his wife Martha, who'd taken a maternal interest in Grace and had been providing Eleanor with borrowed baby clothes and advice. Eleanor wore her cleanest dress, still patched and worn, but respectable. Daniel wore a suit that had obviously been stored for years, smelling faintly of cedar and belonging to a time when he'd attended social occasions. Grace slept through the entire ceremony, unaware that her life had just been fundamentally altered. The preacher was brief and efficient, asking the required questions and pronouncing them married with minimal ceremony. Daniel kissed Eleanor's forehead, the same chaste gesture he might give a sister, and then they were signed, sealed, and legally bound. "Congratulations," Dr. Morrison said afterward, shaking Daniel's hand. "Take care of them both, Crawford." "That's the plan." Daniel turned to Eleanor. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Crawford?" The name still felt strange, like wearing someone else's clothes, but Eleanor nodded, shifting Grace in her arms. "Ready." The journey back to Daniel's ranch took most of the day, traveling slowly to avoid jostling the baby. Eleanor sat beside Daniel on the wagon seat. Grace nestled between them in a basket Daniel had lined with soft blankets. They didn't talk much during the ride, both lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just committed to. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, more contemplative, like two business partners who'd just signed a complex contract and were now considering all the implications. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting in spectacular fashion, painting the whole sky in shades of orange and purple. Daniel helped Eleanor down from the wagon, carefully lifted Grace's basket. "Welcome home," he said simply. Home. Eleanor looked at the white house with its green shutters, the well-maintained barn, the expanse of land stretching in every direction. This was home now. Not the cabin she and Marcus had built, but this established, solid place. It should have felt like defeat, surrendering her independence, accepting shelter from a man who wasn't the husband she'd chosen out of love. But instead, it felt like arriving somewhere she hadn't known she was traveling toward. A place where she could finally stop fighting quite so hard, stop proving quite so constantly that she was strong enough to survive alone. Inside, Daniel showed her around with the air of a tour guide, rather than a husband claiming his bride. "Main bedroom is there. It was Sarah's and mine. I've been sleeping in the back room since she died. You and Grace should take the main room. It's bigger, gets better light, and there's space for a cradle." "Daniel, I can't take your bedroom." "Yes, you can. You're my wife now, and Grace is my daughter in the eyes of the law. This is your home as much as mine. More, actually, since you'll be here more often while I'm out working." He set Grace's basket on the kitchen table. "Besides, that room should have a baby in it. Sarah would have wanted that." Eleanor didn't argue further. She was too tired, and the practicality of his reasoning was sound. She followed him upstairs, where he showed her the main bedroom, large and airy, with a beautiful quilt on the bed and lace curtains at the windows. Clearly Sarah's touches, preserved exactly as she'd left them. "I can change things if you want," Daniel said, reading her hesitation. "Put Sarah's personal items away. Make it more yours." "No, leave it. She made this beautiful, and I'd rather honor that than erase it." Eleanor set Grace's basket on the bed. "I'm not trying to replace her, Daniel. I hope you know that." "I do know that. And you're not replacing her. You're something entirely different. A partner I chose because I respect what you're trying to build, not because I'm trying to recreate what I lost." He moved toward the door. "I'll bring up your things. You get settled, feed Grace, rest. We can figure out the rest as we go." After he left, Eleanor sank onto the bed, soft and comfortable in a way she'd almost forgotten beds could be, and looked around the room that was now somehow hers. Grace stirred in her basket, beginning to fuss with hunger. Eleanor lifted her daughter, settled into the rocking chair by the window, and began to nurse. Through the glass, she could see the last light fading from the sky, stars beginning to emerge in the vast darkness. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to Grace. "This is strange and complicated, but we're going to be all right. You have a father now, not by blood, but by choice, and that might be even better. Below, she could hear Daniel moving through the house, doing evening chores, settling into routines that would now include 2 additional people. The sounds were domestic and comforting: footsteps on stairs, water running, the gentle movements of someone creating order from the day's chaos. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself imagine this life extending forward, learning to cook in Daniel's kitchen, managing the ranch house, raising Grace in this solid place, Daniel coming home each evening to company instead of emptiness, the 2 of them building something functional and good, if not traditionally romantic. It wouldn't be the life she'd imagined when she married Marcus, full of youthful optimism and romantic notions about frontier adventure. But it might be something better, something built on honesty and mutual respect rather than passion that could fade when reality proved harder than expected. Grace finished nursing and fell asleep, her small mouth going slack, milk dribbling from the corner. Eleanor wiped her daughter's face with gentle fingers, studying the perfect features that were somehow both Marcus's and entirely Grace's own. "Your father, your first father, would have loved you so much," Eleanor whispered, "and Daniel will too in his own way. Different but real. You're lucky, little one. You get to be loved by 2 good men even if one of them never got to meet you." A soft knock at the door, Daniel's voice, careful and quiet. "Eleanor, I brought your trunk up. Can I come in?" "Yes." He entered. With her small trunk balanced on one shoulder, set it carefully at the foot of the bed. He glanced at Grace sleeping in Eleanor's arms, and something tender crossed his weathered face. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "You did well bringing her into the world under such difficult circumstances. We did well. I couldn't have managed without you. We make a good team then. That's a promising foundation for a marriage, even an unconventional one." Daniel moved toward the door again, then paused. "Eleanor, I meant what I said earlier. This is your home now. Everything in it is as much yours as mine. Don't ever feel like you're a guest or you have to ask permission to belong here." "Thank you, Daniel, for all of this, for being decent when you didn't have to be." "Being decent is the bare minimum. You deserved better than what life handed you. I'm just glad I could help even the odds a little." He smiled slightly. "Good night, Mrs. Crawford. Sleep well." After he left, Eleanor tucked Grace into the cradle Daniel had brought from storage, the same cradle that had waited empty for the child he and Sarah had lost. She pulled back the quilt on the bed, slipped between sheets that smelled like lavender and sunshine, and let her exhausted body finally rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to this strange arrangement they'd committed to, but tonight she was warm and safe and not alone. Tonight, that was enough. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the eaves, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. Inside, in the house Daniel Crawford had built with his first wife and now shared with his second, 2 people who'd found each other through tragedy, began the slow process of building something that might eventually feel like family. Not the family either had imagined, but perhaps in time the family both had needed all along. The first morning as Mrs. Crawford, Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on the stairs. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the soft mattress, the absence of wind whistling through cabin gaps. Then Grace made a small sound from her cradle, and reality settled back into place. She was married. Again. To a man she'd known for less than 2 months. Eleanor rose carefully, her body still tender from childbirth, and tended to Grace before dressing. When she finally made her way downstairs, she found Daniel at the kitchen table, already dressed for work, a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "There's more on the stove," he said without looking up from the newspaper he was reading. "Coffee's fresh. Grace sleep all right?" She woke twice to nurse, but otherwise yes. Eleanor served herself, poured coffee, sat across from him at the table that felt too large for two people. "What's your schedule today?" "Riding out to check the north pasture fencing. One of my men reported breaks yesterday, probably elk moving through. I'll be back by late afternoon." He folded the newspaper. "You'll be all right here alone?" "I've been alone for weeks, Daniel. I think I can manage a day." "Fair point." He stood, carried his plate to the sink. "There's a bell on the porch. If you need help for any reason, emergency with Grace, someone shows up who makes you uncomfortable, anything, ring it 3 times. My men know to come running if they hear it." Eleanor hadn't expected that level of consideration. "Thank you, that's thoughtful. It's practical. I'm not leaving you isolated without a way to call for help if needed." He collected his hat and coat. "Oh, and Eleanor, feel free to change anything in the house that doesn't suit you. Move furniture, reorganize the kitchen, whatever makes you comfortable. This is your home now, not a museum to my first marriage." After he left, Eleanor sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to process the strangeness of her new life. Everything about this place was easier than the cabin. Running water from an indoor pump, a stove that heated evenly, windows that didn't leak. But ease came with its own discomfort. She felt like an imposter playing house in someone else's carefully constructed life. Grace's cries from upstairs pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. She climbed the stairs to find her daughter red-faced and furious, tiny fists waving in outrage at the injustice of being awake and hungry. "I know, little one, I know." Eleanor lifted her, settled into the rocking chair, and began to nurse. "Everything's different now. We have to get used to it together." The morning passed in the mundane rhythms of infant care, feeding, changing, brief periods of sleep punctuated by more feeding. Eleanor explored the house between Grace's demands, opening cupboards and drawers, learning where things were kept. She found evidence of Sarah everywhere. Recipe cards written in delicate script, embroidered dish towels, a sewing basket filled with carefully organized thread. In the parlor, a photograph on the mantel showed a younger Daniel with a petite blonde woman, both smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of people who believed their happiness was permanent. Eleanor studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the smiling man in the image with the weathered, grief-worn Daniel she knew. How much had loss changed him? And what remained of the person he'd been before Sarah died? She was still standing there when hoofbeats approached the house. Eleanor's first instinct was caution. She moved to the window, peered out carefully. A woman on horseback, wearing practical riding clothes and a determined expression. Eleanor opened the door before the woman could knock. Grace balanced on her hip. "Can I help you?" The woman dismounted with easy grace, tied her horse to the porch rail. "You must be Eleanor. I'm Catherine Morrison, Dr. Morrison's wife. I thought I'd come by and see how you're settling in." Eleanor relaxed slightly. Catherine had been kind during those days in Clearwater, bringing baby clothes and offering advice without judgment. "Come in. I was just about to make tea." They settled in the kitchen, Grace sleeping in Catherine's competent arms, while Eleanor prepared tea with supplies she was still learning the location of. "So," Catherine said once they were both seated, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Crawford?" "Strange, practical, like wearing boots that aren't quite broken in yet. They serve their purpose, but they don't feel natural." Eleanor sipped her tea. "Is that terrible to say?" "It's honest, and honestly, most marriages start with a lot less compatibility than what you and Daniel have. You respect each other, you work well together, and you're both too practical to expect fairy tale romance." Catherine smiled. "That's a better foundation than half the love matches I've seen crumble after the first hard winter. Did Daniel tell people why we married? That it's an arrangement, not a love match? He didn't have to. Everyone knows Daniel Crawford well enough to understand he'd never remarry out of passion. He loved Sarah too completely for that. Catherine handed Grace back as the baby began to stir. But what he's doing, giving you and Grace protection, security, legal standing, that's its own kind of love. The practical kind that builds futures instead of just feeling good in the moment. Eleanor absorbed this, feeling some of her uncertainty ease. People will still talk, though, about how quickly we married, about the circumstances. Let them talk. By spring, there'll be new scandals to occupy them. And in the meantime, you'll have a warm house, food on the table, and help raising Grace. That's worth a little gossip. Catherine stood to leave. I'll come by weekly if that suits you. Check on Grace. Bring you news from town. Give you adult conversation that isn't about cattle and fencing. I'd like that. Thank you, Catherine. After she left, Eleanor fed Grace again and thought about what Catherine had said. Practical love versus passionate love. Building futures versus feeling good in the moment. She'd had passion with Marcus. Impulsive, optimistic, convinced love could overcome any obstacle. And it had been wonderful until it wasn't. Until the obstacles proved larger than their love could bridge. Maybe practical love was better. Maybe choosing someone based on respect and compatibility rather than overwhelming emotion would build something that lasted beyond the first crisis. Daniel returned as promised in late afternoon, muddy and tired. He washed at the pump outside before entering, another small courtesy Eleanor appreciated. Fence is fixed, found what was breaking it too, bull elk with a taste for wandering. We'll need to reinforce that whole section before winter. He poured himself coffee from the pot Eleanor had kept warm. How was your day? Quiet. Catherine Morrison visited. Grace slept well between feedings. Eleanor stirred the stew she'd made for dinner, her first attempt at cooking in this kitchen using supplies she'd found in the well-stocked pantry. I hope you like beef stew. I wasn't sure what you normally eat. I normally eat whatever I can heat quickly. This smells like actual cooking. Daniel sat at the table watching her move around the kitchen. You don't have to cook for me, Eleanor. That wasn't part of our agreement. I have to cook for myself anyway. Making extra isn't a burden, it's efficient. She ladled stew into bowls. Besides, you fixed my roof, delivered my baby, and married me to save my reputation. The least I can do is provide decent meals. Those things weren't transactional. I didn't do them expecting repayment. I know, but I can still choose to contribute to this household in ways that make sense. Eleanor set his bowl in front of him. Let me do this, Daniel. Let me feel useful instead of just rescued. He studied her face, seemed to understand something in her expression. All right, but only if you let me help with dishes after. Partnership means shared work, remember? They ate together, conversation flowing more easily than Eleanor had expected. Daniel told her about his men, Jack and Tom, both steady workers who'd been with him for years. Eleanor told him about her explorations of the house, her discovery of Sarah's recipe cards. You should use them, Daniel said. Sarah would have wanted her recipes used, not preserved like museum pieces. She believed food was meant to be shared, that the best way to honor someone was to keep their traditions alive. Tell me about her, Eleanor said impulsively. Not the tragic parts, the real parts, what she was like. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. He told Eleanor about Sarah's laugh, which was louder than expected from such a small woman, about her terrible singing voice and her insistence on singing anyway, about how she'd insisted on painting the house white because it reminded her of New England, even though Daniel had argued that white showed every speck of dirt. She was stubborn, he said with a smile. sweetly stubborn, the kind that wore you down through persistent cheerfulness until you agreed just to make her happy. And she was brave in ways I didn't appreciate until after she was gone. Coming out here, building this life, she was terrified, but she did it anyway because she believed in what we were creating. Eleanor felt unexpected kinship with a woman she'd never met. She sounds remarkable. She was, and she'd like you, I think. Would appreciate your practicality, your refusal to pretend things are easier than they are. Daniel carried dishes to the sink. You're different from her in most ways, but similar in the ones that matter. The stubbornness, the courage, the determination to build something good, even when circumstances argue against it. They washed dishes side by side, falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly domestic. When Grace cried from upstairs, Daniel said, "Go tend to her. I'll finish. Here." Eleanor climbed the stairs to find Grace hungry and indignant. She settled into the rocking chair, began to nurse, and found herself thinking about the comparison Daniel had drawn. She and Sarah, different but similar. Both women who'd chosen hard paths and committed to seeing them through. The days began to develop their own rhythm. Daniel rose early, did morning chores, ate breakfast with Eleanor before heading out to work the ranch. Eleanor managed the house, cared for Grace, and slowly began to feel less like a guest and more like someone who belonged. She made small changes, rearranging the kitchen to suit her height, moving furniture in the parlor to create space for Grace to eventually play, planting herbs in pots on the windowsill. Daniel noticed each change and approved them all, seeming genuinely pleased that she was claiming space as her own. A week into the marriage, Eleanor woke in the middle of the night to Grace's cries. She rose groggy and fumbling and nearly collided with Daniel in the hallway. He'd apparently woken too, though his room was at the opposite end of the house. "I've got her," Eleanor said. "You don't need to wake up every time. I'm already awake. Let me help." Daniel followed her into the bedroom, lit the lamp while Eleanor changed Grace's diaper. When the baby continued fussing after being fed and changed, clearly just wanting comfort, Daniel said, "May I?" Eleanor handed Grace over, watched this large man cradle her tiny daughter with surprising gentleness. He walked the room slowly, humming something tuneless and soothing, until Grace's cries subsided into small hiccuping sounds and then silence. "You're good at that," Eleanor observed. "Had practice. Sarah's sister visited when she was pregnant, and I helped with her baby when he was fussy. Learned that sometimes they just need movement and sound. Doesn't matter if you can't carry a tune." He laid Grace back in the cradle, stroked her cheek with one calloused finger. "She's a good baby. Hardly cries at all. She cries plenty at 2 in the morning. That's when all babies cry. It's in their contract." Daniel smiled. "Go back to sleep, Eleanor. I'll listen for her for the rest of the night. You need rest more than I do." "Daniel, you work all day, and I can function on less sleep than a woman still recovering from childbirth. Let me do this. Please." Eleanor was too tired to argue. She climbed back into bed and, to her surprise, fell asleep almost immediately, trusting that Daniel would wake if Grace needed her. She woke at dawn to find him asleep in the rocking chair, Grace peaceful in her cradle, and felt something shift in her chest. This arrangement they'd made, this practical business-like marriage, was becoming something more complicated. Not romance exactly, but genuine care, mutual reliance, the slow building of trust that came from showing up day after day, choosing to help instead of turning away. Eleanor rose quietly, covered Daniel with a blanket, and went downstairs to start coffee. When he came down an hour later, stiff from sleeping in the chair, she had breakfast ready and didn't mention his sacrifice. Some kindnesses were better acknowledged through reciprocal action than words. 2 weeks into their marriage, a letter arrived from Eleanor's father. Catherine Morrison brought it during her weekly visit, her expression concerned. The postmaster asked me to deliver this, said it came from Philadelphia, thought it might be important. Eleanor took the envelope, recognized her father's aggressive handwriting. She almost threw it in the stove unread, but curiosity won. She opened it, read the brief message. Eleanor, I've learned of your remarriage to a rancher named Crawford. I assume this was another impulsive decision made without proper consideration. When this marriage fails like the last one, don't expect my help. You've made your choices. Live with them. Your father, Eleanor, read it twice, waiting for the hurt to come. But all she felt was a distant sort of pity for a man so rigid he'd rather be right than connected to his daughter and granddaughter. She handed the letter to Catherine. My father blessing my new marriage with his characteristic warmth. Catherine read it, her expression darkening. What a miserable old man. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Don't be. He's been like this my whole life. I stopped expecting different years ago. Eleanor took the letter back, held it over the stove's open firebox. The only thing that's changed is I no longer care what he thinks. She dropped the letter into the flames, watched it curl and blacken. When Daniel came home that evening, she told him about it matter-of-factly, treating it as information he should know rather than a wound requiring comfort. Your father sounds like a fool, Daniel said simply. His loss, not yours. Exactly. Eleanor poured him coffee. I have a family now, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose. That's worth more than his approval ever was. Daniel met her eyes across the table, and Eleanor saw understanding there. He knew about chosen family, about building connections based on mutual respect rather than obligation. His ranch hands were as close to brothers as he had. The community he'd built through years of neighboring and helping, that was his family now, more than whatever distant relatives he'd left behind in Pennsylvania. To chosen family, Daniel said, raising his coffee cup. Eleanor clinked her cup against his. To chosen family. That night, after Grace was asleep and the house was quiet, Eleanor sat in the parlor with the mending basket Sarah had left behind. She was repairing one of Daniel's shirts, replacing buttons and reinforcing seams when he came in from checking the barn one final time. You don't have to do that, he said, but without heat. They'd had this conversation enough times that it had become routine rather than argument. I know, I want to. Eleanor bit off thread, examined her work. Daniel, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think this, what we're building here, do you think it could become something real? Not just a practical arrangement, but an actual marriage? Daniel sat in the chair across from her, considered the question seriously. I think it already is real, maybe not in the traditional sense, but real in the ways that matter. We're partners. We care about each other's well-being. We're raising Grace together. That's more authentic than a lot of marriages that started with passion and ended in resentment. But do you think we could ever? Eleanor struggled for words. I'm not asking for romance or grand gestures, but do you think we could be more than cordial roommates? Could we be friends? Real friends? The kind who actually enjoy each other's company? I already enjoy your company, Eleanor. I come home each day looking forward to dinner conversation. I like knowing you're here, that the house isn't empty anymore. I like watching you with Grace, seeing how naturally motherhood comes to you, even when you're terrified you're doing it wrong. He smiled. I'd say we're already friends. The question is whether you feel the same. Eleanor thought about the past 2 weeks, about shared meals and midnight baby care, about the easy way they'd fallen into partnership, dividing household tasks without needing to negotiate every detail, about how safe she felt here, how she'd stopped bracing for criticism or demands. Yes, she said quietly, I think we're friends. And that's more than I had any right to hope for when we made this arrangement. then we're ahead of where we need to be. Everything else can develop in its own time if it's meant to. Daniel stood, stretched. I'm going to turn in. You should too. Grace will be up in a few hours demanding her midnight snack. Eleanor nodded but didn't move immediately. She sat in the lamplight with Sarah's mending basket and her own complicated feelings, and thought about how strange life was. 2 months ago she'd been desperately alone, convinced she had to fight every battle herself. Now she was married to a man she respected, living in a house that was becoming home, raising her daughter with help instead of in isolation. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but maybe it was better than what she'd planned. Maybe practical love and chosen family and friendship built on respect were worth more than romantic passion that burned bright and died fast. Grace cried from upstairs. Eleanor rose to tend to her and found Daniel already there in the hallway, both of them moving toward their daughter without discussion or negotiation. Partnership, Eleanor thought. This was what real partnership looked like. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but two people showing up in the middle of the night, sharing the burden so neither had to carry it alone. She could build a life on that foundation. In fact, she already was. Winter arrived, in Wyoming with the subtlety of an avalanche. 1 week the fields were brown and dormant, the next they were buried under 3 feet of snow. Daniel had been right to insist Eleanor and Grace stay at the main house. Her cabin, solid as it now was, would have been brutally cold through the months ahead. Grace was 4 months old now, plump and healthy, no longer the fragile premature infant who'd arrived too early in a wagon bed. She'd learned to smile deliberately, to track faces with her dark eyes, to make sounds that almost resembled conversation. Eleanor watched her daughter grow stronger each day and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. The ranch settled into winter routines. Daniel's men moved the cattle to lower pastures, broke ice on water troughs each morning, hauled feed to animals that could no longer graze. Eleanor managed the house, cooked meals that grew more elaborate as she mastered Sarah's recipes and discovered she had a talent for making bread that even Daniel's taciturn ranch hands praised. "Best biscuits I've had since my mother died," Jack told her one morning when the hands came to the house for breakfast, before heading out into brutal cold. "You've got the touch, Mrs. Crawford." The name still felt strange, but less so each time someone used it. Eleanor Crawford, a woman with a place, a purpose, a family she'd chosen rather than been born into. January brought a cold snap so severe that Daniel insisted the ranch hands sleep in the barn loft rather than risk the mile walk to their cabin. Eleanor cooked for 5 instead of 2 and found herself enjoying the company, the noise, the feeling of feeding people who genuinely appreciated the effort. Tom, the younger of Daniel's men, had a talent for storytelling. He'd entertain them through supper with tales of cattle drives and stampedes, embellishing shamelessly until even his own companions called him a liar. Grace would watch him with fascinated attention, as if she understood the performance, even if the words meant nothing yet. "You're a natural with the baby," Eleanor told Tom one evening, as he made faces at Grace that sent her into fits of delighted laughter. "Got 6 younger siblings back in Texas. Practically raised half of them myself before I headed north." He tickled Grace's chin gently. "Always liked babies. They don't judge you for being young or stupid or making mistakes. They just want someone who shows up and pays attention." Eleanor thought about that later, after the hands had retreated to the barn and the house was quiet except for the wind howling outside. Showing up and paying attention. That's what Daniel had done for her. Not fixing everything, not solving all her problems, just consistently being present when she needed help. She was learning to do the same for him. Small things mostly, making sure his coffee was ready before dawn, mending his work clothes before he had to ask, noticing when he came home with that particular tension in his shoulders that meant the day had been hard and not filling the silence with chatter he didn't need. One night in late January, Daniel came home later than usual, ice crusted in his beard, his hands so cold they were clumsy on the buttons of his coat. Eleanor took one look at him and began heating water for a bath. "You don't need to," he started. "Hush, go sit by the fire. I'll bring you coffee while the water heats." He obeyed, too cold to argue. Eleanor brought him coffee laced with honey and a measure of whiskey she'd found in the pantry. He drank it gratefully, color slowly returning to his face. "Lost a calf today," he said finally. "Got separated from its mother in the storm. By the time we found it, it was already gone. Froze to death maybe 100 yards from shelter." Eleanor sat beside him, close enough to share warmth. "I'm sorry. That's hard. It's the way of things. You lose some every winter, but it never stops being hard, watching something die when you were too late to save it." He stared into the fire. "Makes me think about Sarah, about how I was too late then, too." Eleanor had learned not to deflect when Daniel mentioned Sarah. He needed to speak about her, to keep her memory alive through words. "You couldn't have known she'd go into labor early. You couldn't have predicted it." Doesn't make it easier. Doesn't change the fact that she died alone, scared, calling for me, and I wasn't there. His voice was flat, stating facts without self-pity, but Eleanor heard the old pain beneath it. "Grace didn't die alone," Eleanor said quietly. "When she came early, I wasn't alone because you refused to leave me. You couldn't save Sarah, but you saved us. That matters, Daniel. It matters more than you probably realize." He looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. "You're not just saying that to make me feel better." "I've never just said anything to make you feel better. When have I ever spared your feelings?" She smiled slightly. "I'm saying it because it's true. You saved our lives. Grace is alive because you knew what to do and didn't panic. I'm alive because you got me to the doctor in time. Those are facts, not comfort." Daniel reached over, took her hand in his. His fingers were still cold from the ride home, but his grip was warm with intention. "Thank you for that, and for everything else, for making this house feel like a home again, for being patient while I figure out how to be married again, for not expecting me to be someone I'm not." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Same to you, for all of it." They sat like that until the water was hot enough for bathing, hands linked, watching the fire, comfortable in silence that needed no filling. When Eleanor finally rose to prepare the bath, Daniel kept hold of her hand a moment longer. "Eleanor, I want you to know this arrangement we made, this practical marriage, it's become more than that for me. I don't know what to call it yet, but it's real. You're real to me, not a replacement for what I lost, but something new that I didn't know I needed." Eleanor's throat tightened. "You're real to me too. More real than I expected when we stood in that church and made promises we weren't sure we could keep." "Do you think we've kept them, the promises?" "Yes, in every way that matters." Eleanor pulled her hand free gently. "Now go bathe before you freeze solid. I'll keep Grace quiet so you can actually soak instead of rush." February brought a thaw, then another storm, then cautious signs that spring might eventually arrive. Grace learned to roll over, a milestone that both delighted and terrified Eleanor, as her daughter became suddenly mobile. Daniel built a wooden frame with netting to contain her during the day, creating a safe space where Grace could practice her new skills without Eleanor needing to watch every second. "You're good at this," Eleanor observed, watching him sand the frame until it was smooth enough that Grace couldn't get splinters. "Good at what?" "Basic carpentry." "Good at being a father. You didn't have to be. The marriage gave Grace your name, but you've given her more than that. You've given her attention and affection, and the kind of steady presence every child needs. Daniel tested the frame's stability. She's easy to love. Babies usually are. They don't have complicated histories or walls they've built to protect themselves. They just trust that you'll show up and care for them. Is that a commentary on Grace or on me? On both of you, and on myself. He met her eyes. We're all learning to trust again, Eleanor. Grace has it easiest because she's never been hurt. We're the ones who have to work at it. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Eleanor had spent months protecting herself, convinced that needing anyone was weakness. Even now, married and settled, she still caught herself holding back, not asking for help when she needed it, trying to prove she could manage alone. "I'm working on it," she said quietly. "The trusting part. It's harder than I expected." "I know. I'm working on it too." Daniel lifted the finished frame. "Let's see if our girl approves of her new territory." They placed the frame in the parlor near the fire. Grace took to it immediately, rolling back and forth with delighted determination, making sounds of triumph each time she succeeded. Eleanor and Daniel sat on the floor nearby, watching their daughter discover her own capabilities. "She's going to be trouble when she's older," Daniel predicted. "That much determination in someone so small, she'll either build an empire or tear down mountains. Or both." Eleanor tickled Grace's foot, earning a gurgle of laughter. "She's got Marcus's stubborn streak and my refusal to quit. That's a dangerous combination. Best kind of dangerous, the kind that changes the world." In March, the final snows melted and the land began its slow transformation to green. Daniel started talking about spring planting, about putting in a larger garden now that there were more people to feed. Eleanor mentioned wanting to visit her cabin to see what condition it was in after months of neglect. They rode out together on the first truly warm day, Grace bundled in a carrier on Eleanor's chest. The cabin looked small and rough compared to Daniel's house. One room with a loft, walls that showed every gap and imperfection in daylight. But the roof was solid, Daniel's repairs having held through winter's assault. Inside, everything was as Eleanor had left it. Her few possessions, Marcus's tools, the narrow bed where she'd slept alone and terrified. It felt like visiting a museum of her former life, seeing evidence of who she'd been before everything changed. "Do you want to keep it?" Daniel asked. "The claim's still in your name. We could fix it up, use it for storage or for the hands during busy seasons." Eleanor walked the small space, running her hand along the rough walls Marcus had built with more enthusiasm than skill. She thought about the girl who'd lived here, who'd believed love and determination could overcome any obstacle. That girl had been wrong about a lot of things, but right about enough that she'd survived. "Yes, I want to keep it. Not to live in, but to remember. This is where I learned I was stronger than I thought. Where I dug a well 7 months pregnant because giving up wasn't an option. That's worth preserving. Then we'll maintain it, make sure it stays solid." Daniel touched one of the support beams he'd replaced. "Marcus would be glad you survived this, Eleanor. Glad Grace has what she needs. Do you think about him? About what it means that you're raising his daughter?" "Sometimes. Mostly, I think he must have been a good man to earn your loyalty, even after death. And I think he'd approve of this arrangement, of you choosing survival over sentiment." Daniel turned to face her. "I don't see myself as replacing him, Eleanor. He's Grace's father in the ways that matter. Blood and love and the life you built together. I'm just the man who gets to help raise her, which is a privilege I don't take lightly." Eleanor crossed to him, stood close enough to see the silver threading through his beard, the weathered lines around his eyes. "You're more than just the man who helps raise her. You're her father in every practical sense, the one who'll teach her to ride and build things and face hard truths without flinching." Marcus gave her life, but you're giving her everything else. We're giving her everything else, you and me, together. Yes, together. Eleanor reached up, touched his face gently. It was the most deliberately intimate gesture she'd made since their marriage, and she saw surprise flicker in his eyes. Thank you, Daniel, for all of it, for seeing us in that road and deciding we were worth the trouble. You were never trouble, you were possibility. He covered her hand with his, pressed it closer to his face. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. These past months, living with you, learning who you are beyond the desperate woman I met digging a well, I've developed feelings I didn't expect. Real feelings, not just respect or friendship. Eleanor's heart began to pound. What kind of feelings? The kind that make me want this to be a real marriage in every sense. Not just sharing a house and raising a child, but actually sharing a life. The kind that make me hope you might feel the same, even though I know it's early and complicated, and neither of us planned for this. He paused. I'm in love with you, Eleanor. Not despite who you are, but because of it. Because you're stubborn and brave and refuse to let circumstances break you. Because you make bread that puts mine to shame and you sing to grace, even though you can't carry a tune. And you've made my house feel like a home instead of a shrine to loss. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too. I didn't mean to. I tried not to. But somewhere between you delivering my baby and fixing my roof and showing up every single day without expecting praise or repayment, I fell in love with you. She laughed shakily. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement. When did it stop being practical? Probably around the time we started actually enjoying each other's company. Or maybe when you started leaving coffee exactly how I like it, without me asking. Or when I started coming home early just to have more time with you and Grace. Daniel pulled her closer. Does it matter when it happened? No. What matters is what we do about it now. What do you want to do about it? Eleanor thought about the main bedroom with its beautiful quilt and lace curtains, still Sarah's room in many ways. She thought about the careful distance she and Daniel had maintained, separate rooms and polite boundaries. She thought about trust and vulnerability and the terrifying prospect of letting someone all the way in. I want to stop being scared, she said. I want to stop protecting myself from something good because I'm afraid it'll hurt if I lose it. I want this to be a real marriage, Daniel, in every way. He kissed her then, gentle and tentative, and full of possibility. It was nothing like the brief, formal kiss at their wedding. This was real, a promise and a question and an answer all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Grace chose that moment to voice her opinion with a loud, indignant cry. They laughed, the tension breaking into something light and joyful. She's got terrible timing, Daniel observed. She's 4 months old. Timing isn't exactly her strong suit yet. Eleanor adjusted Grace's carrier. We should head back. Storm clouds are building and I'd rather not get caught in the rain. They rode home together, Grace content between them, and Eleanor felt the last pieces of her carefully guarded heart settle into place. She'd spent so long protecting herself, convinced that needing anyone would destroy her. But Daniel had proven that needing someone and being needed in return could be strength instead of weakness. That evening, after Grace was asleep and the house was quiet, Eleanor moved her few remaining possessions from the guest room into the main bedroom. Daniel helped without comment, understanding the significance of the gesture. Are you sure? He asked as they stood in the doorway together. We can take this as slowly as you need. I'm sure. I want to share this room, this bed, this life with you, fully and completely, no more holding back. Eleanor touched the quilt Sarah had made. Do you think she'd mind? Your first wife, me taking her place. You're not taking her place. You're creating your own place, one that's uniquely yours. Daniel put his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. And no, she wouldn't mind. Sarah believed in moving forward, in embracing life instead of hiding from it. She'd approve of both of us choosing happiness again. They stood there a moment longer, then Eleanor turned into Daniel's embrace, let herself be held completely, and felt safer than she had since Marcus died. Maybe safer than she'd ever felt, because this wasn't the naive safety of inexperience. This was the hard-won safety of knowing someone's worst and choosing them anyway. The months that followed were not perfect. There were disagreements about money and ranch management, about how to handle Grace's teething and whether to plant corn or wheat in the south field. There were days when grief for their first spouses hit unexpectedly, when Eleanor or Daniel would need space to process old pain. But there were more days of laughter and collaboration, more evenings spent on the porch watching sunset paint the sky impossible colors, more mornings waking together and facing whatever challenges arose as a team instead of struggling alone. By the time Grace turned 1, walking unsteadily and babbling constantly in her own incomprehensible language, Eleanor had proven up her original claim. The deed was in her name, securing Grace's inheritance and Eleanor's independence. But she spent most of her time at the main ranch, which had become home in ways the cabin never quite had. On Grace's first birthday, they threw a celebration. Catherine Morrison came with her husband, bringing cake and presents. Daniel's ranch hands decorated the barn with ribbons that Grace immediately tried to eat. Even Jack and Tom, who claimed to be hardened ranchmen, made complete fools of themselves trying to make the birthday girl laugh. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the chaos with Daniel beside her, and felt contentment so complete it was almost frightening. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked. "That a year ago I was digging a well alone, 7 months pregnant, convinced I had to do everything myself or I'd proven some kind of failure." Eleanor leaned against him. "And now I'm here, married to you, watching our daughter destroy a cake. With impressive efficiency, surrounded by people who've become family. It doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real. We built it together, one stubborn day at a time." Daniel kissed her temple. "And we'll keep building it. Whatever comes next, more children if we're lucky, droughts and winters and all the challenges this territory throws at us, we'll face it together." "Together," Eleanor agreed. "I like the sound of that." Grace, covered in cake and gleeful about it, toddled over to them with her arms raised. Daniel scooped her up, cake and all, swinging her high enough to make her shriek with laughter. Eleanor watched her husband and daughter together and thought about how strange life was, how it could take everything away, and then, when you least expected it, give back more than you'd lost. She'd come to Wyoming territory as Marcus Hayes's wife, believing love and optimism could overcome any obstacle. She'd learned the hard way that love wasn't always enough, that survival required more than romantic ideals. But she'd also learned that practical love, the kind built on respect and partnership and choosing someone every single day, could be stronger than passion. That accepting help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. That family wasn't just who you were born to, but who you chose and who chose you back. As the sun set over the ranch that had become home, Eleanor Crawford stood with her husband and daughter and the community they'd built, and understood with perfect clarity that she'd found exactly what she needed. Not what she'd planned for, not what she'd imagined when she first headed west, full of naive dreams. Something better, something real, something worth every hard day and difficult choice it had taken to get here. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and growing things. Grace laughed in Daniel's arms. The ranch hands started a fire for roasting corn, Catherine called everyone to gather for photographs, and Eleanor, who'd once believed she had to face everything alone, stood in the center of her chosen family and finally, completely, let herself belong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.